muted and muted and all right, I think we are up and running, so I'm going to go ahead and say hello and welcome to the Bible study, everyone. It takes us a second sometimes to get the technology working at the beginning of putting this on YouTube. So to those that are joining us by YouTube, good morning. And those that are on the Zoom, well, also good morning. We've been having a nice time of conversation and sharing prayer requests and prayer concerns. And so if you watch this on YouTube and would like to join us for that part as well, the link is in the newsletter. It's in the Word. If you can't find it there, it should be there. If you can't find it there, let me know and we'll get you a link and get you in. So good morning. It's a strange day when we're gathered here. We knew going into this week that it was going to be a long week and didn't know quite what the week may hold. But here we are. And we're not going to spend the whole day talking about the election and the election results. But I did want to at least acknowledge that as we're getting started in our conversation, that this is on so many of our hearts this morning. It's on so many of our minds, thinking about the election results, and it's just sort of in the air. And you know, it's a strange time because I don't think either side of the political spectrum got exactly what they were looking for this week. It wasn't for those that were hoping President Trump would be reelected and affirmed in his leadership. It seems that Biden has won. I think we're pretty clear on that, but they're still counting everything, and we'll kind of let the process unfold. And for those on the left that were hoping that Biden would win and when the Democrats would get control of all the chambers of Congress with a big sweeping mandate, well, that didn't really happen either. It seems to be a much more mixed bag, and we're left in this situation of seeing that the reality is we are a divided nation and a divided people. And I think that division is not just external to us. Somehow we feel that in our own community and our own church and our families. These divisions are deep and strong. And so we're left saying, well, what do we do as a nation? How do we live here and live in this time? And I don't think that is a hopeless question. I think that is a challenging question, but I think that is, we as a people have been through challenging times before. And there are also opportunities for us as the people of God to show something unique in this time. And so this morning for our Bible study, we're going to continue where we've been alternating Lamentations and 1 Corinthians. And today we are in 1 Corinthians with some very familiar words that perhaps have something to say to us about living in a time such as this. And so we're going to read 1 Corinthians 13. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and put that up so that we can read through it. I say that, I'm going to take just a minute longer to find it first and then share my screen. This is a passage that's very familiar to us, and you will recognize these words and perhaps be able to say them in one translation or another as we go through. But would someone that's on the Zoom call like to read those for us? I know it takes a second to unmute, but feel free, whoever, to go ahead and unmute and read this whole passage. We can just hear these familiar words.
I will read for us, Will.
Thank you.
If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love.
All right. Thank you, Val. I will put that down for a minute. We'll pull it back up as we go through our discussion, but familiar words. Where does it feel like you are listening to that verse? Does anyone have flashbacks to being in a different location or a different occasion than this one? I see people nodding and mouthing the words, a wedding. Yes, this is in some ways the wedding chapter. We often hear this verse read at weddings and these verses, and they are not written for a wedding. This is not the occasion of the letter of 1 Corinthians, but it is often read there, and I thought we should start there. And why is this passage read so often at weddings? What does it teach us about loving relationships, or what do you think? Why do we hear this at a wedding?
Well, I think it has all the prescription of a successful relationship, whether that be a group or individuals, and that is, if it's approached from all of these indicia of love, it's got a much better chance of success and progress going forward.
Yes. Anybody want to add to that? Or disagree if you want to. You're welcome to disagree, but I have a hard time thinking this is not a good way to base a marriage or a friendship or a church or any kind of relationships with folks.
Maybe even a country.
Go ahead.
Maybe even a country.
Maybe even a country. Yes. I think we could use more of these qualities among our leaders, but also all of us. And so, so this is a popular wedding passage, I think, for good reason. It shows what love looks like, and it describes it sort of paints a picture for us. It's very poetic, and the language is memorable. And I think that's part of the power of it, is that it's not this sort of bland description. It is lovely to listen to, and it's love. Love is described this way. So I want us to kind of think about that as we're going through and reading these verses and analyzing them a little bit. It's kind of remembering this as a foundation for a loving relationship, and that being kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about division in the Corinthian church or relationships in our own church or in our country. At the foundation of it is how to be in a loving relationship with people. So let's look at those first few verses. I'll share it again. And it, as you saw, it begins by listing several admirable abilities and actions, and it's taking place within this Corinthian context. And so we have to remember, this chapter does not stand alone. This is not a standalone book. This is part of this longer letter. And we've been seeing in past weeks that the Corinthian church is divided and has different loyalties to different leaders within the church. And evidently, there's also some bragging and boasting about those that feel they are especially gifted, and those that could speak in tongues or have these prophetic powers or whatever it may be, felt that they were the most important church members and everyone else should listen to them and do what they say and admire them. And that's where this passage begins, is by talking about those gifts. So let me pull this up for us again. It says, if I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, or in verse 2, if I have prophetic powers, if I give away all my possessions, all those things mean nothing without love. And so I think in some ways this feels maybe a little distant for us. Are we speaking in tongues, or the the tongues of mortals, so speaking other people's languages, or the tongues of angels, this idea that there is a language that the angels speak, this heavenly language, and some people could tune into that and speak this heavenly language. This is a little different from our Sunday morning worship experience, but I think we could perhaps relate to maybe whether it's ourselves or others feeling like, oh, I'm pretty talented, or I have these special gifts, or, oh, this person is pretty special. Look how devoted they are. And yet here it says, if you don't have love, I am nothing, I gain nothing. Why is that? Why do these things need to be exercised in love? And is there a danger in those powers without love?
Well, I think going back to when you started off talking about the election, and not to bring us to the election, but you were like, well, we're so close, and so obviously we're a divided country, and we are a divided country. And I remember this horrific bumper sticker that used to be, 25, 30 years ago, peace through superior firepower. And I think, Democrats, Republicans have gotten into that peace through superior firepower. Like, I'm going to have the best argument. I'm going to win. And peace only comes by getting everyone to come onto your side. Which I think is the core to all on both sides of the problem. Because I think we're not looking for that in between, but we're looking for the prophetic that, so to me, this is telling me that even if I had that and I could have the best debate and the best argument, if I don't love that other side, I got nothing. So even if I win, I lose. So, and then if you take it to the wedding piece of the 50-50, some people, more conservative Christians, go into a wedding to 60-40, but we come in to say wedding to 50-50. So, that we go into that love with a 50-50, so not superior firepower. But if we love the other side, that's how we're going to win. So to me, I just view that like we got to be careful because we can't win. It's love. It's not winning.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Brad. It is so often framed now as this, there are two sides to everything. There have to be two sides. There's an us and a them, and we win if they lose. And that kind of binary polarization that's not a community. That is not and that cannot work in a church. It can't work in the church in Corinth. And I think we're all feeling like, the way this doesn't seem to work as a country either. And it certainly doesn't work in a relationship. And so how to base that instead in love. Yeah.
And Will, for me, I mean, those qualities that they're talking about tend to be, if I do this, if I do this, if I do this, if love is anything, at least for me, both in, a marriage relationship and a church community and any kind of community, it has to involve some sort of compromise. You have to be willing to see the other side and to make some sacrifices, not just compromise, but make sacrifices. And that to me is where the love comes in that I feel is lacking in a lot of the situations that we're talking about. Is nobody wants to even see the other side, much less try to compromise and say, ooh, that might actually be a good idea, even though it's coming from some other place. And it's happened in our church a number of times, and we could probably talk about them, but that to me is, it's not about me. And I think that's what those first verses are talking about. It doesn't matter if I have all this power and everything. If I don't have the ability to see others, then it's worthless.
Yeah, that's a great point, Larry. I really appreciate that it does start with a lot of I, right? If I speak in tongues of mortals and angels, it's very much about me. When I'm boasting in these different things, that's very much about I, and that's not a way to have a relationship, because love requires loving something else, loving someone else. If I just say, oh, I am so loving in some sort of abstract sense, maybe that's nice, but that doesn't really mean much unless you're saying that you love someone or something or an idea or a cause or something. But but really, love requires this other person that you're loving. Yeah.
And this is God's love, and necessarily means a relationship. So I think these first verses are just saying love is ultimately important. In fact, in the end, that's all that lasts, relationships.
And I don't want to offend anybody, but I have to say, he's speaking to schisms in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And today there are schisms. Is that the right word?
Schism.
Schisms in the church. I have come across and studied a little bit a group of nationwide, a group of Christians who believe that Trump was elected, and I don't know if we want to go to politics. He was elected and chosen by God to lead our nation back to being a Christian nation. And he even said so much. We used to know this child when we had our first church in Kentucky. And he's now a pastor, a Baptist pastor. And he keeps posting all this stuff on Facebook. And I tried to engage him in a conversation through messaging, like, hey, I used to know you. Why don't you tell me more about where you are with this? And he even said as much as, if you don't vote for Trump, you're not Christian. And how do we work with that? I've decided I just need to let it alone, because every avenue of trying to connect with him on what we can agree on failed.
It is so hard.
Welcome your thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, it is so hard, and hard to know how to, like you said, how to engage with people that see the world very differently, and how do we do that? And I don't want this to entirely be about politics, because this is about much more than politics, but
yes,
it certainly does speak to our politics. And I think we're also wrong if we completely avoid talking about anything that's outside of our very narrow scope. And so I think this does affect how we do it. And I think what we see in these verses, in a way, is that love has to be at the core of whatever we're doing. And so if we're speaking in tongues, or whatever the list of things are, if you don't have love, it's not worth anything. So love has to be at the center of that. And I think that has to impact how we have these conversations with each other too. Kind of as Brad was saying, if we're going into these conversations in order to win them and convince the other side that we're right, or convince them how wrong they are, not necessarily a loving motivation behind it. And I think when we're able to have the conversations well, it's usually within family or church or trusted friendships where we do love each other, and that love can be the foundation of it. And we go into it knowing that we love the person. But it's hard with politics, and it's hard this year when everyone's tensions are so high, and the stakes feel so high, and the pandemic has raised everyone's anxieties as well, and all the other stuff that's brewing just makes it all so hard to touch and hard to talk about. But I think there is certainly a danger when we equate our politics and our faith too closely, where we say voting for either candidate is the only faithful thing a Christian can do. And I think I don't want to sort of play both sides kind of game here, but we do hear that all around. You can, for any issue, but it's much more complicated than that, and it's more nuanced than that. And I think that kind of a conversation takes love, and maybe it takes these qualities that we read in the next little session. So let's kind of hold on to that as we keep reading these middle verses, because I think we hear some qualities here that may guide how we have those conversations with people we disagree with, and how we have conversations with people we agree with, because sometimes it's those conversations that don't always show love either. So let me just read these verses 4 through 7, and we'll talk about them a little bit. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Beautiful words to read at a wedding in this very idealistic, optimistic way. I imagine most of us read those words and also feel a bit challenged by them. I put on the little handout, where do you find yourself challenged by these words? I'm not going to make you claim various ones that you struggle with or that you feel, like, oh, that doesn't describe me today. But I think these are challenging for us. And it's kind of funny, we hear these as these beautiful wedding words, but they can also be read with a bit more of an edge to them. John Calvin, in his description of this, said, I have no doubt that Paul intended it to reprimand the Corinthians in an indirect way by confronting them with a situation quite the reverse of their own, so that they might recognize their own faults by contrast with what they saw. So when you all read this, I'm curious, do you hear this as just this lovely poem about what love is like, or do you hear this as a critique of the Corinthian church, or some of each? How do you hear these words?
We have
Go ahead.
We have a comment on YouTube from Jack Averill. He said, if we stand across from each other, we're opposing. If we stand side by side looking at the issue from our individual perspectives, we can learn from each other and seek a way through the problem. And I would add to Jack's comment, I think these verses of what love is invite us to start from common ground, because it tells us love does not insist on its own way. And we have to have some ability to allow there to be a different way than our own in order for us to continue being in relationship with people and to learn from one another. And Martha Ballinger says on YouTube, I have trouble with patience. Me too, Martha.
Yes.
And the phrase, the patience of Job, if you think about his story, a great example of having to have patience through all his struggles.
But it's not easy, is it? This list, patience, but any of the others listed in there as well, all of these are what we're going for on our best day. But I think whenever you read a list like that, it's easy to see how you may have fallen short.
That's exactly where I was. I was thinking about my relationship in my home with this person, which is lovely, but sometimes I struggle with insisting on my own way or whatever.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with Jane there. I have the most trouble. I mean, I have a little bit of trouble with patience, as my wife will tell you, but wanting my own way is not just in that relationship, but in lots of situations. I know of circumstances I've gotten even with church folks where it was, I like to do things my way, and sometimes that's not necessarily the best attitude to have. So that's the one I struggle with the most, and I see all of these verses as a challenge, not as, I know why they read it at weddings, but to me, it's not, oh, this is the way your love is. It's, no, this is the way you need to be and ought to be, and you're probably not going to be all the time.
So we take it from the personal level to friendship level to the church level and then to the world. It's a lot there.
Well, if you look at,
go ahead, Brad, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, if you look who wrote it, Paul, I remember a sermon ages ago at UBC, a guest speaker came in, and then part of his sermon was listed how many times he was flogged, he was stoned twice, he was, so, here's a man who kept coming after it. So I think it's a challenge for us. So, so someone is saying you're not a Christian, or, how many times we hear, well, this person's so bad that I'm taking them off of Facebook. My mom talked like, hey, is this the end of the world right now? And I'm like, Mom, you're a depression baby. You've been through the Depression. You've been through World War II. How is this worse than you've been through? So I think we have to make sure that when we look at the guidance and the leadership we see in the Bible, they put up with a heck of a lot worse than a few mean words. Sticks and stones, he dealt with sticks and stones. So I think that, but he kept coming. So I don't think that means always giving in. I think you can still be passionate about something. And Paul certainly was, he probably was an obnoxious person to be around, because he probably never gave in, but he kept coming back and he kept engaging, even though they flogged him and stoned him and did all the different things. So I still think we can love, and certainly look for compromise, but that doesn't mean we can't be passionate and still have great resolve towards certain things.
I really appreciate that, Brad, because I think that's sometimes the let's all come together message is sort of presented in a way that says, let's stop having disagreements, but stop caring about these things, stop having feelings, just agree. And that's not really what it is. I mean, we can feel passionately, and we should feel passionately about lots of things. We see that in Paul, we see it in Jesus, we see an intense caring about people and about ideas and about a way of living in the world. And it's okay to be disappointed, and it's okay to be happy. It's okay to have all of those feelings and passion about it. Yet what is underneath all of that is there a love beneath it, and is love in how we go about expressing that and going through it.
A couple more comments from YouTube. Elizabeth Mulcahy says, sometimes it is loving to point out a wrong or a lie. For example, when my daughter lies, it is loving for me to tell her, you are wrong. It is wrong to lie. And Joanne Averill says, what if you really believe you are loving and right in your point of view, and the other person is hateful? And I think those are good points. We are looking at a passage about love, but sometimes the most loving thing we can do is point out when someone is hateful and when someone is just flat out lying or saying the wrong thing, or those have to be considerations that sometimes our most loving thing is to not compromise on our morality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what makes this all messy, isn't it? Is that when we're all insisting on our own way, we think our ways are right, and there are times when we are right and shouldn't just give up everything to find the comfortable middle ground where everyone agrees. Because there are things we shouldn't compromise on, and we may disagree on what things those are. And so I think this is going to be messy, and I don't think there's a simplistic answer to these questions, because that is the nature of the world that we live in, and the nature of the church that we are part of, the global church. We all have disagreements, and so I think that is the challenge: is how do we disagree lovingly, but be willing to disagree and be willing to see things differently, and to even to care strongly about those and still do it in a loving way. Yeah. Something I saw about these verses in one of the commentaries was noting how in verses 4-7, love is patient and kind, not envious. But all these things are not necessarily inherent qualities to us. I am a person who is patient. And we struggle in different ways with different ones of these, but all of these are not exactly things about us, like how tall we are or something. They are habits. They are decisions that we make over and over again. It's a pattern of behavior that we try not to insist on our own way, even though we do sometimes. Sometimes we're going to be irritable and resentful, and then we try not to be. And so I think all of these, perhaps that is a hopeful thing about this, is that this kind of love is not some quality that either we have or we don't. It's something that we choose to, it's a way that we choose to behave, a way that we choose to interact with each other. And I think that includes those hard kinds of disagreements where we really do think we're right and think the other person is wrong, and think we need to confront that. And that's okay. Love rejoices in the truth, it says. And yet can be done lovingly. So this does not mean life's going to be easy. I think the Corinthian church continued to have troubles. And maybe that segues us well to this last part here. The love never ends. As for prophecies, these end. I won't read all this part again for us, but we have here this contrast in this last paragraph between how we are now in this present moment and the limitations that we have. We know only in part, we prophesy only in part. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. There's all in the mirror dimly now, there's all this now part where we are limited in what we understand and what we know. And yet somehow we rejoice and look forward to this time of knowing when we will know fully, we will be fully known. And so I think perhaps that is in a way Paul's response to this idea that yes, it is hard now, and we do know we may not be right. We all have our own way, but it's not necessarily the right way, and we don't always know. But that is part of living right now. That is part of how we live. So maybe let me just ask one kind of closing question about that. How, in light of that, how do we live and act faithfully when we know that we might be wrong or that we have limited information, limited as we are? How do we respond faithfully?
Will, I think this whole chapter is really about how we treat each other. And in a sense, it's calling us to not be enemies, regardless of what others are saying or doing. And I don't mean this as a political statement. I mean it as an illustration of real love. I felt like the president-elect's speech last night was in essence saying, let's give love a chance.
Yeah, I think I think you're right. It is about how we disagree. It is about how we live, about how we talk, about how we have conversations as churches, as relationships, and whether it's, I think we see in this chapter, whether it's youth at a wedding, whether it's how we load the dishwasher and one person does it right and one person does it wrong, and you have to work through that in love, or much larger disagreements about how we move forward as a nation. In some ways, it's the same principle. It's patience and kindness and not insisting on your own way and telling the truth. But whatever you're doing, making it not just about me, not having I at the center, but about love and about this loving relationship. Anybody else want to add to this conversation? I know we've covered a lot of ground, and it always keeps circling back to love. I'll check YouTube one more time too, or Val, you'll check YouTube one more time. We're good. And anybody else want to add anything else before we close?
I was thinking of the phrase "speak the truth in love," and that's been a hard thing for me through the years. I'd rather, not confront. I don't know if I've ever. Maybe I grew up thinking you don't do that. If you're a Christian, you just keep on being kind and nice, instead of speaking up when you should, when you feel like it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, no, I relate to that. And I heard someone, I think it was Brian McLaren once, saying that the power of the phrase, we see that differently. And just leaving it at that, about not trying to convince the other person that you're right and they're wrong, but also not just being silent and pretending you agree, but just trying to say, it's okay that we can see things differently. We can disagree on some things, and we can still hold love at the center and stay connected in that way. So.
Martha Ballinger says, if someone will load the dishwasher, they can do it any way they like. But I have to, I disagree. Martha and I are going to have to learn how to love one another in our disagreement, because I think there is absolutely a wrong way to load my dishwasher.
On the bottom line, doesn't it all come down to how we are oriented or how we orient our life? We're oriented towards winning. And that's the dominant thing. That's a very self-centered orientation and causes us to use our strengths and powers in a way that has a great danger of being very destructive. But if we're orienting our life view towards love, then we are going to do all these things we've talked about. We are going to be open to somebody else's opinion. We're going to be anxious to persuade rather than dominate.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right, Ed. And maybe that's a good place for us to kind of wrap up this conversation. I think if we learned anything this week, we learned that this world needs more people guided by verses that we've just read, and needs more of us. And it is important that we live this way, not just for our own sakes, but for the sake of our community and all those around us. And so it is a challenge, but I think this is the challenge that has been given to us. It's what it means for us to live as Christians, is to live loving others and not with ourselves at the center. So let me offer us a word of prayer and we can close. God, we thank you for these beautiful words that have echoed through the centuries, that continue to speak to us, to challenge us and convict us in ways, and yet also to inspire us. So God, help us as we go through our lives, in our relationships and friendships, in our church, in our society, wherever we are interacting with others. Help us to make these decisions over and over again, not to put ourselves at the center, but to focus on love of others and our love for you. Help us to be more loving, that we can make this world more loving as we serve you together. In Christ's name, amen. All right. Well, thank you all for being here.